Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on mapping research approaches to the demographic dividend. I'm Marlene Lee, Program Director of Academic Research and Relations in International Programs at PRB. We have a diverse group joining us today, and I want to thank you all for your interest. A special welcome to our Francophone audience. We wanted to let you know that we plan to translate the webinar slides and make these available in a couple of weeks. So please stay tuned to our website, www.prb.org, for notice when the translated slides become available. So what is the demographic dividend? It's an accelerated economic growth that may result from rapid decline in a country's fertility rate and the subsequent change in the population age structure. When we talk about economic growth, we're actually talking about increased production of goods and services that are assessed often with a dollar value or a currency monetary value. Key characteristics of change of the demographic dividend include change in the population age structure, a larger working age population results from a change in the age structure. This comes about through lower mortality and decline in fertility rates. Dependency ratios become more favorable. That is, the ratio of the elderly and young, non-working age population is lower with respect to the number of those in the working age population. This frees up resources that can lead to appropriate investments that will bring about economic growth. The population structure is essentially what enables growth, and you should be seeing now a graph that shows you this larger size working age population relative to the young dependent population. Demographic changes lead to economic surplus. That's essentially the argument behind the demographic dividend. It's not guaranteed, but there is the potential. The surplus can be used in ways that will benefit the economy, including investment in human capital, usually investments in education and health, productive investments and investment in public goods, and improved consumption levels, better nutrition, access to more food. So without further ado, after this brief introduction to the demographic changes that have potential to leading to a demographic dividend, I am going to introduce our main speaker for this webinar, Dr. Parfait Eloundou-Enyegue, and he will be presenting models of the demographic dividend. Dr. Eloundou-Enyegue is a professor at Cornell University in the Department of Sociology and Demography. With support from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, Dr. Eloundou-Enyegue is leading a 6-year effort to advance demographic research and policy in Francophone Africa. He also serves on PRB's Board of Trustees. We're very pleased to have Dr. Eloundou-Enyegue with us here today to present on mapping research approaches to the demographic dividend. Without further ado, I will pass things over to him.
Thank you, Marlene. I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to be here and exchange ideas on what I think is a very important topic. The remarks that I'm going to share with you are the results of many conversations with friends all over the world, and some of these friends are acknowledged in the final slide in my PowerPoint. There are too many to list, but I just listed a few. Now, this is not an easy subject to address, and this is not an easy audience either. I suspect that everybody in this group has heard something about the demographic dividend. In fact, I know that a few of the participants that I saw signed up are in fact pioneers in the scientific work being done in that area, or even in the policies that are being implemented to harness the dividend. But I'm going to nonetheless argue that even as we all know about the demographic dividend, even if we all know something about the demographic dividend, my bet is that when it comes to the specifics, that is, what is really the demographic dividend, how likely it is, how large it is, how do we measure it, what are the circumstances that make it possible, we are likely to hear responses that are either contradictory or a little too vague in ways that do not lend themselves to very specific policy guidance. And so the purpose of my webinar is to try to map out the demographic dividend, that is to try to make sense of the apparent contradictions that we find in the current discourse on the demographic dividend. And so with this in mind, I have organized my presentation around three main points that you should now see on your screen. The first point that I'm going to make is that the notion of the demographic dividend is on the map. That is a pretty popular notion now that is talked about just about by everyone and talked about everywhere. The second point is that even though the demographic dividend is popular, the positions on the dividend tend to be all over the map. Then you have people who tend to see it as being a particularly potent force for economic development, whereas others would dismiss it as really a minor influence. And so we have a diversity of viewpoints on how big the demographic dividend is. And so what I'm going to do is try to bridge or try to map the dividend, which is try to reconcile the differences that we see in the assessments of the dividend. And after this review, I'm going to conclude with what I call a triple triangulation, which is just a fancy term to see that we need collaboration in three particular areas. One of the areas in which we need triangulation, collaboration, or integration is in terms of the methods that are being used. A second area of triangulation or collaboration would be to integrate the various processes by which fertility changes can affect economic growth. And the third area of collaboration or triangulation is in reconciling and enabling collaboration between different groups that are working on this question. So this is the basic outline that I'm going to try to follow. And let's start with the basic definition of a dividend. The notion of the demographic dividend rests on two very simple ideas. The first idea is the notion of age dependency. Simply put, you can divide every national population in two subgroups that are defined by age. You have the very young at the bottom, you have the very old, and in the middle you have the adult population. There's a further assumption that this middle group is supporting both the young and old. And presumably, the more people you have in the middle, the lower the dependency burden that is placed on the population. So that's the first point when you just look at the population from a cross-sectional perspective. Now, if you look at this historically, there's the expectation that all countries in the world evolve, or at least the age structure of the populations evolve, from a first phase where you have higher birth rates, and therefore you're going to have a large number of children, therefore a large dependency burden. Then you move into a second phase where fertility rates are going down, and so you have a narrower base and a much bigger middle than you had in the previous case. And then you move into a larger final stage where eventually the middle stabilizes, and now the top part of your age pyramid becomes bigger. And so essentially you have three phases. The first in which you have a high dependency burden driven by the large young population, and the last phase where you have a large dependency burden, this time driven by the old population. And so out of these three phases, the middle phase, which is represented here in the middle, is the one that is most favorable to investment in economic growth because you have a low dependency burden, not many babies, not many older people. And so that gives us the definition that you heard about before. That is, the demographic dividend is the expected accelerated growth that may result from a rapid decline in country's fertility and subsequent change in the population age structure. And this is really something that happens in this middle stage. And for many countries, including a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, this phase, the middle phase, happens to be about now. If you look at the trends in dependency burden, or the average for African population is described in green on your screen, and you can begin to see that the time when the countries are going below the 80 ratio threshold, which is basically where you expect the dependency burden to be favorable to investment in economic growth, is about now on average. You do have differences across country. Niger, for instance, is still far behind, but you have a few countries ahead, but the average is about now. And so for that reason, as well as other reasons that I'm going to discuss later, this ground to be interested in the demographic dividend and the opportunity that it might present for economic growth in high fertility countries or low-income countries. So the notion is popular, and I'm going to show you a few signs of this popularity, or the fact that whether you look across space over time or across different groups, everybody is currently debating the demographic dividend. The map you have before your eyes now shows places where you had events about the demographic dividend over the last 2 years or so. This map was constructed by the Population Reference Bureau based on events that they knew about. And so you can see a fairly wide geographic spread, which indicates the geographic popularity of the notion of a dividend. If you look over time, you can see the numbers you see on your screen now indicate the number of scholarly articles that have been published on the dividend, either because they contained they either contain the term dividend in the title, or the dividend is really the subject. And so the point of this chart is really to show a steady rise in the references to the demographic dividend. So this is a notion that has become increasingly popular over the last 10, 15 years or so. This is not true only of scholarly articles. The next graph that you have now on your screen shows the references in news articles. And again, here you can see a peak in the last 5 years or so. You have an increasing number of references in magazines and newspapers about the demographic dividend. Finally, even if you look across groups, the dividend is not something that interests only academic researchers. You have it debated by journalists, policymakers, and so forth. The picture you have here shows you a session in which parliamentarians in Burkina Faso were debating with researchers from Francophone Africa to discuss the prospect or the perspective offered by the demographic dividends in their particular countries. The point here is whether you look across space, across time, or across different groups, this is really a notion that is on the map. Okay. Now, it's easy to understand why this notion would be on the map or why it would be appealing. As I said before, the window of opportunity for many countries is now. But in addition to this, for demographers, the dividend seemed to be an interesting middle position in the theoretical debate on population between views that are extremely positive versus views that are extremely negative about the potential effects of population growth or population change on socioeconomic development. And so it allows to bridge the difference between the extremely negative and the extremely positive views. And so that's one part of the appeal for theoretical demographers. Now, for demographers as well as many other social scientists, the argument of a dividend seems very plausible because the central argument in the demographic dividend is that it's something that has to do with changes in the age structure. And so many social scientists would expect most social processes, many outcomes to depend to have an age pattern. So if you look at mortality, for instance, you can clearly see an age gradient, an age pattern of mortality, very high in the early years of age, goes down later before coming back later up. Fertility shows the same age gradient, although the shape is slightly different. Even if you move away from purely demographic concept, if you see the propensity to commit crime, you also have an age pattern. So it seems very plausible that just like mortality, just like fertility, just like crime, economic behavior, i.e. consumption, earnings, saving, investment, would have an age pattern as well. Okay, so it's a very intuitive and very plausible idea. Final reason why this notion is appealing is from a policy standpoint. It's a very timely notion at a moment where many countries in the world are interested in the Millennium Development Goal as well as the SDGs. And if you look at these goals, many of them have a strong demographic component, whether it's maternal health, child health, or even poverty reduction. There's a strong demographic component there. And so for all of these reasons, you can understand why so many people in so many places would be interested in the prospect that the demographic transformation offer for economic change in their respective countries. In many countries, in fact, the aspiration or the expectations go beyond just meeting Millennium Development Goals. You have fairly ambitious expectations in many African countries where the goal is now actually to emerge, to reach middle income status. And so the obvious example here is Korea, a country that in the 40 years since 1970 increased its GDP per capita tenfold in a span of just 40 years. And so the question is, are we going to have other countries follow this kind of lead? Are we going to have other tigers emerging in different parts of the world? And so the answer to this question is very mixed. As I said before, it's kind of all over the map. Okay, so you have at both extremes those who would say without any reservation no, and at the same time you have a fairly optimistic view that not only can you have other tigers, but also that the demographic dividend could be a big part of that story. But for the most part, I think the most common view is in the middle. Most analysts of the demographic dividend would say that the dividend is a possibility. It's an opportunity, but it is contingent on appropriate policy. It depends on putting together the right policies. Some may say the dividend exists, but it's going to be relatively small in comparison to the influence of socioeconomic policy and other factors, that is going to be short-lived, that is going to be narrowly economic and not trickle down to the rest of the population. So the middle position is one that is that you can qualify as a yes, but. Okay. Beyond this disagreement, the other interesting thing is that some of the assessments tend to be a little vague. Very often you find statements to the effect that, well, to achieve the demographic dividend, you need to have, quote unquote, the right policy, the appropriate policy. And you really don't have any clear indication of what the appropriate policies might be in great detail in ways that are specific to individual countries. And so the challenge for us is to bring a little bit of specificity to that debate and to bridge some of the differences that we see in the assessment of the dividend. Now, and this brings us to the third part of this presentation, which is essentially the longer, which is about mapping the dividend. And the question that I try to raise here is, why are we so vague about this notion of the dividend? Why do you have different assessment, different conclusions about the same topic? And so I will start with the first basic point, that disagreement in science, or in social science in particular, are not uncommon. And if you think about them, if you think about their sources, typically they can be traced to three different sources. The first source tends to be context, by which we mean just because you observe a dividend in South Korea just because you observe a social outcome, a social process somewhere in the world, does not mean that the same process is going to occur somewhere else, just because the situation, the circumstances are very different. The culture, the economy, the history, the etc. Okay, so the real differences in context can actually be one source, one reason why we find differences in the assessment of the dividend. So we should expect some variation across countries. But I would say this is not an important source of difference. Another possibility would be ideology. By this we mean that, well, even if we are researchers, we may not always embrace evidence with an open mind. Rather, we tend to stick with our preconceived notion of how the world works. And so we stick to our guns regardless of what the evidence shows. Again, this is a theoretical possibility, but I don't think it's really the important reason why we find differences around the dividend. In my view, the most important reason why we find differences in our assessment of the dividend has to do with methodology, which is the set of methods or the toolkit that we bring to our study of the dividend. To the extent that different researchers, different scientists use different methods, different approaches, it's not surprising that these scientists are going to reach different conclusions, because their methods, their frameworks, their perspectives are going to lead them into different directions. And I'm going to try to illustrate, give you a review of the different methods that have been applied and give you a sense of their relative strengths and weaknesses and how they can steer our understanding in one direction versus the other. When we think about method, we can actually focus on three main elements. The first element is measures and definition, what we mean by the dividend. The second element that I'm going to discuss shortly has to do with the conceptual process that we have implicitly in our minds. And the third is this statistical analysis that we are going to use. Let's start with the definition. The basic difference that I have found here across the field in discussing the dividend, in other words, if you say, what is the dividend? I think you're going to have different answers. Some researchers are going to have a very strict, a very narrow definition of the dividend. For these researchers, the dividend is restricted to the effect of population change as mediated by a structure, nothing else. If population affects economic outcome via another channel, that's not the dividend. The main channel that we may be interested in here would be a structure, and we focus on the short-term effect. If you really want to have a very narrow definition and you don't look at the long-term effect, you don't look at the ripple effect, there's a tendency to focus on the effect of a structure on growth rather than on a whole host of socioeconomic outcomes, and we focus on the aggregate picture. So that's the narrow view. That's the strict view. Now, you can have an expanded view of the dividend in which you are not restricting yourself to a structure as the only mediator. You are going to look at the effect of demographic transformation via any chain, any process that you can imagine. You can look at the first and second dividend, you can look at ripple effects, you can look at consequences not just for growth, but also inequality, the status of women, you can look at the effect of transformation on schooling, health, and so forth. So you look at a wide range of outcomes beyond just economic growth. Okay, so that's one first methodological difference that I wanted to highlight here. Again, I simplify, but the point here is that you can very well imagine that if I utilize a narrow definition and somebody else uses or implies a large definition, we are very unlikely to find similar results. Number one, the person with a larger definition is likely to find a bigger effect, but also their results are going to be less consistent because you have many pieces to put together. On the other hand, if you have a narrow definition, then it's likely that you're going to have a more consistent picture, but at least the effect of the dividend is going to be very narrow. Some might say underestimated. Okay. So first methodological difference that we ought to pay attention to is the breadth of the definition. And I can show later that different methods have either explicitly or implicitly used different definitions of the dividend. Second methodological difference that is worth paying attention to is the conceptual framework. And here, just as we made a distinction between narrow versus broad definition, we also make a difference here between narrow, concise, black box frameworks versus frameworks that are more expanded. What you have before you now is what I would consider a narrow definition, a black box definition. You don't have a lot of detail. So you have a very simple system in which a decline in fertility leads to age dependency, which leads to changes in saving and investment levels, which finally leads to economic growth. Okay, and so under this simple framework, things are easy to model, but also it gives you particularly narrow assessment. Now, some researchers can make this picture a little bit more complicated. So for instance, they would say, well, age dependency does not necessarily or directly lead to saving and investment. You have to consider the difference between age dependency and economic dependency. Researchers like Basu or Abouderin at APHRC have drawn the distinction between the two terms. Just because you happen to be 65 above 65 doesn't mean you are dependent. Or just because you happen to be under 15 doesn't mean you are dependent either. Or for that matter, if you're an adult, it doesn't mean that you're active and can support other members of your population. So it's an important distinction to be made. Another important refinement here can be to acknowledge that economic dependency can affect saving and investment and ultimately economic growth through two different channels. One is what I'm going to call behavioral effect. I'm going to explain what it means a little shortly. And the other is a more compositional or mechanical effect. I'll return to this. You can even consider ripple effect. Once you have growth, this has secondary implication for a whole host of social processes, underemployment, stress, competition, marriage market, and so forth. And it's a question whether or not you want to consider this. The third is the return, the feedback effects. Once you have growth, that growth can feed back into fertility decline, and you may end up having a virtuous cycle in which fertility leads to growth, which leads to fertility, and so forth. Okay. You can even make the framework even more complicated by including inequality. The fertility change doesn't happen at the same rate across the entire population. You can actually have a lot of inequality in fertility change, which in turn is going to lead to a lot of inequality in economic situation. And so the point here is that you can have a framework that is relatively simple and narrow, or a framework that is very detailed. Again, depending on whether you use a narrow, a simple, versus a detailed framework, your results are going to be more or less stable. They're going to be more or less complete. And so this is one important element that may in fact explain the differences that we find in the results. Now you could actually have frameworks that are even more complicated than this. You have frameworks, for instance, as the one in the PRB that integrates the interaction between population structure and broader policy and changes in the education and health sector, for instance. The bottom line is we ought to pay attention to the frameworks that different researchers have been used and how they affect the findings that they ultimately report. Now, I talked about the important difference between behavioral and compositional effect. That is, fertility change, changes in age structure can affect the economy in two different ways that need to be integrated. Let me try to illustrate what these two effects are. In the picture you have here, you have an imaginary society with the top and the bottom being your dependent population, and the middle here you have your active population. So the ratio of dependent to adults is 2:1, and therefore if you assume that the adults earn $300 per person, the average income per person is going to be $100. Now fast forward to time 2, and you have this society that moves from an income per person of $100 to $200. And a different scenario, you have the same population that moves still to $200 per person. Now, even as you have the same outcome in these two situations, the reasons why the incomes increase in this society are very different from the reason why they increase here. Here at the top is what we might call a behavioral effect. The age structure of your population didn't change. What changed is the income among your adult population. Instead of 300, they're now earning 600 per person, hence the change that we have here for the total income per capita over the entire population. Now contrast this with the bottom. Here the income per person among the adult population didn't change. What changed is the size of this adult population. It doubled, and that's the reason why this doubled here. So you have two different processes through which this transformation, a society here, can affect changes in the economy. And this is what we are going to call behavioral versus compositional effect. And as I will show later, different methods vary in the extent to which they acknowledge both processes at the same time. Okay. And so if you look at the diversity of method that we find in the field, let's try by starting with what would be an ideal method. If you had the best method in the world that met all the criteria that we would like that method to meet, we'd like a method that captures what I just described here, the compositional effect, but also the behavioral effect. You need a method that is country specific. That is, a method that generates finding for each country, as opposed to importing the finding from one country to make policy prescription for another country. You need a method that provides results that are internally valid, that go beyond just correlation. It can actually determine the extent to which changes in population cause change in the economy. You need other criteria, and I just took a very small sample here. You need methods that are culturally grounded, that are resting on culturally valid notion of dependency. You need methods that are transparent, so that the average user can actually figure out where the data come from, how you move from point A to point B before they can actually trust your finding. And you can also need methods that are user-friendly. Data are easy to access, or at least are available. You don't, an average policymaker can have access to templates that make it possible to try different simulations. So these are a variety of criteria that you can use. And as I'm going to argue, very few, if not none, no method combines all these, meets all these criteria. If you map out the existing method, they fall along a continuum that looks like this, okay? With here at the top, methods that tend to meet the criteria of national level relevance as well as country specificity, but at the same time they may not be internally valid and do not provide behavioral detail. At the bottom here, you have methods that are maybe internally valid, but they don't provide results that rise to the level of countries, and they may not be available for all the countries. And so if you consider this method and plot them along this two-dimensional axis, you'll see that as you move from the bottom here, you have methods that are very micro. That is, the unit of analysis tend to be a person or household. At the top here, you have methods that are macro, meaning the unit of analysis tend to be countries as a whole. You move from left to right, you have methods on the left here that tend to appeal to academic researchers, and to the right, methods that tend to appeal to policymakers. And so as you move from southwest to northeast, you're going to have on this bottom edge method that there's a bit of a trade-off between methods that appeal to policymakers and that are macro in nature versus methods that appeal to academic researchers that are micro in nature. Fortunately, you have a set of methods here in the middle that have, in various degrees, tried to bridge the gap between these two sets of criteria. In other words, they try to both be internally valid, but at the same time provide results that are country-specific and relevant at the country level. They do this in different ways. They're not perfect, I would conclude at the end, but at least they try to meet the two sets of demands. And in the slides that you're going to receive, you are going to have each of these methods described in a little bit of detail, including what is the general principle behind the method, what are its pluses and minuses, and occasionally a picture of how essentially the method works. Okay, I'm not going to take you through all of this method. I'm just going to sort of cycle through. You can read them on your own. I'm just going to discuss one that I think is particularly promising for three reasons. Number one, it's restricts itself to what I think is a very close, narrow definition of the dividend. I can bridge the macro and macro demand, and it can be also very flexible, even though, as I would argue later, it's very data hungry and you need a lot of information to actually activate it. And so it's a national transfer accounting. A method has been popularized by Mason and Lee. The basic idea in this method is to try to get very detailed data, age-specific data on patterns of earnings and consumption. So you have the earnings here in blue. That's a curve here in blue. And you have the consumption in orange. And so essentially you have three parts of this curve. On the left here you have sort of a net deficit on the right, and in the middle that's the only place you have a surplus. And so understandably, the more people you have in the middle, the bigger your aggregate surplus. Okay, and so with this method you can, because you have both micro data but also data on age structure, you can actually be able, if you had the data, to capture the behavioral component of the dividend as well as the compositional component of the dividend. Let me show you how it would work, in theory at least. So the chart here shows the net surplus, which is negative in the first section, negative in the second section, and then positive only here in the middle. And so if you overlay this with the age structure, we took here an age structure that is particularly characteristic of high fertility country, many people in the young age groups, and a smaller number of people here. So by bringing these two together, you can estimate the aggregate surplus for the country. Now, if you happen to have a change in demographic structure, which is in pink here, that is, you have fewer people in the younger group and more in the middle, then your aggregate surplus is going to increase, but it's going to increase just as a function of the change in age structure. But nothing says that the consumption profile has to stay steady. It can also change. And so you can have the darker blue curve here that substitute to the lighter blue, and therefore you're going to have a different aggregate surplus. And so if you have data both on changes in the age structure and in the consumption profile, you could actually project how the aggregate surplus is going to change and essentially capture both the behavioral and compositional effect. Okay. That was just an aside. There are other methods that try to do the same using different approaches, but this was just one illustration. The bottom line, and this is where I wanted to basically end, is that as you review all of this method, here I have some of the method that we just reviewed on the left-hand side. On the right, we have some of the criteria that I've used. And so in green, I have listed the method, the criteria that are met by different methods. And so you can see that some methods are very good at one edge on the left, top left. Some are good at the bottom right. And you have few in the middle here that actually try to bridge the gap between all these methods. But again, none of the method is perfect. And so that leads me to what I wanted to suggest as a conclusion. Again, I would invite you to look at the methods in detail as described in the previous slides. The point here is that none of this method is really perfect, that in the sense that it meets all the criteria that I had enunciated before. Few of these methods fully capture both the behavioral as well as the compositional effect. Few fully capture the need that academic researchers have for rigor, at the same time as they capture the need that policymakers have for practicality, transparency, country specificity, and so forth. And so few are able to meet the needs of different constituencies that participate in the dialogue on this dividend. And so that leads me to the point that I wanted to make at the end, which is we need a triple triangulation, by which I mean something fairly simple, that we need collaboration in terms of method. That is, as we review this method, it's not fruitful to seek out what is the best of all. Rather is to identify the strong insight, the areas where different methods offer strong insight, and then try to just integrate the strength of the different methods so that we can have a more robust triangulated evidence that serves the needs of policymakers. So the first point of collaboration would be to triangulate method. The second would be to triangulate or to integrate the compositional versus the behavioral effect. As I said before, these are two additive but separate channels by which population change can affect economic growth and social outcomes. And so if you just look at one, you miss part of the picture. But at a deeper level, the distinction between compositional and behavioral influences is also reflective of a deeper distinction between population and people. When we study the effect of demographic change, it's tempting to just restrict ourselves to large aggregates, to look at the age pyramid, broad change in population structure, population size, and so forth, and forget that behind this transformation, or underneath this transformation, you have changes in the lives of real people. You have a lot of individual decisions being made by families and households. You have, population is not just about changes in age structure, it's also about changes in the lives of these individuals, in the normative life cycles, how we change our investment in childhood, how we facilitate the transition of young adults into the labor force and into adulthood, how we harness the wisdom, the experience, and the resources of the elderly, how we manage the relationship between these different generations. So population or demography is not just about population, it's also about people and real lives. The third area of collaboration is also a collaboration, it's a more sociological collaboration between the different stakeholders that are involved in this dialogue on the dividend. So it's not the territory of academic researchers alone. We need to involve policymakers and learn from their wisdom. We need to learn from media people. We need to learn from average families and what their concerns are and integrate all that wisdom, integrate deep cultural knowledge into our understanding of the prospect of demographic dividend across the world. And this is where I really want to end. That is personally what I shared with you today was built on many conversations that I've had over the last years. I spent a lot of time on the ground discussing with families, researchers in Africa, policymakers, and I feel I learned a lot from this discussion. I know there's a similar discussion that are being conducted under other projects, including the NTA project. And I hope that these discussions continue, that we continue to integrate the wisdom from different disciplines, from different stakeholders, from different participants. And I hope the webinar that we organized today, at least the first attempt to put together a comprehensive comparative listing of the different methodological approaches, pushes this conversation further. So hopefully it's the beginning of a conversation, not an end, and I look forward to the question that you are going to raise. Thank you. Like this question, would there be a text version along the slides? Yes, we'll work on it. Just as a background, I was asked to do this just, I think, a month ago, and I'll follow this. I found this to be an exciting exercise, and I'll be glad to work a little bit more on this and forward an extended version of this document.
We had another question about whether or not all countries could have a demographic dividend, and which was the first country to have a demographic dividend.
In the world?
Yes.
I wouldn't know how to answer that question. But the question of whether all countries can have a dividend, it's the emphasis on can. Can, I would say yes, but will, it's probably no. One of the frameworks that I showed is a descriptive framework that I called conversion coefficients. It's a descriptive framework that shows different points in which the process of harnessing the dividend is stopped. So for different countries, if you happen to have a decline in fertility, the process can stop at different levels and for different reasons. And so even if you have a descriptive framework that just shows where the process is stalled for one particular country and it's easy to monitor, it's already a good starting point for a conversation on the reason why one particular country doesn't have a dividend. Yes.
Could the time of the demographic dividend differ among regions in one country?
Yes. It's actually a complicated question. If they mean the time of the duration of the window of opportunities, yes. It just depends on how fast the aging process occurs, how deep the fertility declines, and whether the decline is stalled versus rapid. So the time of the window of opportunity can vary, and so can the dividend itself. Again, if you consider just the first dividend, or if you consider the second dividend as well, you can actually reap this effect for a long period of time. And in a broad sense, I see personally the effect of a dividend rippling through generations. That is, if one of the results of the first dividend is to really deepen investment in the next generation, especially in early childhood, then the benefits that you're going to have accrue from that generation are actually a secondary influence of the initial boost that you have to economic growth. So this can be fairly sustained. But it's something that really needs to be nurtured very delicately. The more I talked to different constituencies, both here in Africa and elsewhere, the more I have become convinced of the different facets, the different levers where you can play if you have really informed evidence-based policy. It doesn't mean that it's automatic, but there are many areas in which we can play to leverage the dividend.
And which countries in sub-Saharan Africa do you think are the most likely to achieve the demographic dividend?
To have this, we have a study in which we looked at the early signs of the dividend in schooling, and by which we just sort of monitored the increase in the public spending per pupil. All you have to do, the dividend almost matches the timing of the fertility decline, which is almost normal. That is, if you look at, in our study, we found the countries in West and Southern Africa were the ones where you're beginning to see early sign of a dividend.
Okay, someone else also asked, they have a concern that the policy and planning aspect of the demographic dividend is now being engaged in by almost all African countries as a core development strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Should they all put emphasis on demographic components and then expect a result, or is there a need for an integrated approach?
Oh, a need for an integrated approach. I favor an integrated approach. And I'll go even beyond integrated approach, which is sort of a cross-sector. I really am convinced of the need for integration, not just in different sectors, but also in different disciplinary perspective and different stakeholders. There's really a lot of wisdom on the ground about how to renegotiate or think about families, because the big term is I tend to see demographic dividend basically as family and arrangement between generations, management of life cycle. And so you took that very basic approach, since families are the starting point and the end point of the process that we're interested in, it's really important to keep your ear on the ground and to listen to what regular families have to say. And I'm particularly happy that we had a lot of media people with us today.
There's also a couple questions about cultural factors and how that plays into this subject and whether or not we need to be discussing these factors with policymakers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think there's very good work being initiated by a researcher at APHRC, Abu Dharin, who is really problematizing this, and I know other researchers in the US who do this as well. Look at the older population and the contribution that it can make. And all this is largely culturally grounded. That is, different cultures have different notions of what it means to be an older person. Different cultures have a different understanding of what it means to be a child, and what are the responsibilities of a child, and how much are you willing to invest in different children. How do we maintain traditions of exchange across nuclear families and so forth. So there are a lot of cultural elements that cannot be glossed over and that have to be considered really on a country-by-country basis, or even on sub-country by sub-country basis. So it's a dialogue that has to be fine-grained at the same time as we want to look at the big picture.
Okay, there are a couple of related questions about whether or not the demographic dividend is cyclical, and also have some countries passed their window of opportunity for a demographic dividend.
Some countries in the world, or?
Just said it seems that countries that have passed through the demographic transition may have wasted their demographic dividend.
Right. I mean, you can have, if you are beyond the, if you have completed your fertility transition, then we cannot talk about the demographic dividend in the same terms. The way I understand it, this is a story about countries that are mid-level or high fertility and going through the process of declining fertility and the changes in age structure that are going to follow.
Okay, I'm going to move to the question of available data and some of your technical issues. One question is, could you explain the mechanical effect that you referred to a bit more? And the other question is, are there available data sources, or how do the quality of data affect the ability to analyze the demographic dividend and estimate the effect?
The mechanical, I was a little bit inconsistent in terminology. What I mean by demographic mechanical effect is also what I call compositional effect, which is to say, if you have the composition of your country's population that changes, even if everybody behaves exactly the same, you may have a growth just because you have more adults in your population. Even if these adults consume to the same level, if they have the same income, just by virtue of having more adults relative to younger and older people, you're going to have a compositional effect, a mechanical effect. You don't have to do basically anything. So that's one piece, and the other piece is behavioral. Now, this is actually the part that is easier to document, the compositional effect, because in many, for most countries, we have data on age structure and changes in age structure. What is harder to capture is the changes in behavior, and especially the contribution of demographic forces to these changes in behavior. So, from my experience, the compositional effect or the mechanical effect tends to be relatively is something interesting. Now, if you allow me, there are two questions that are in French here. I don't want to shortchange the French.
Yes.
There's a journalist who says how to explain the dividend to average people in a setting where you see children discussed as wealth, where children are seen as a source of wealth. It's really, and I thank him for that question. It's a question that I've been often asked, and I'd be pleased to send him a more detailed answer if I have his email. It's a question that is debated a lot. So traditionally, you view children and large families as a source of wealth. I think it still is. It's a source of pride. It's a source of joy, accomplishment. It's also a source of wealth, but the terms of that wealth are different. That is, whereas 30 years ago, you didn't really have to invest a lot in a child in order to have them become a fulfilled adult. It's increasingly difficult to do so because you have to make minimal investment in schooling and increasingly large investment in schooling. So it's still the idea is that the idea is not children as no longer valuable. They are always valuable, but and I would even argue that because they are valuable, that's why we need to invest more in them today than in the past. And there's a lot of work that I find really fascinating that I'd like to learn more about that really showcase the importance of early investment in children. That is, even before children enter school or even before they are born, the investment that we make in their health and well-being and security are tremendously important, and they stay with them through their entire lives. And so, yes, children are wealth, and that's why we need to be investing in them.
Parfait, unfortunately, we're going to have to end. We have some good questions that are still there, and we will try to send some email responses. The slides will be available online for those of you who have asked. So look for an announcement on our website. Also, we might be able to beef up the citations. Some people asked about that.
Sure.
We thank you very much for your attention and for staying with us throughout this presentation, and also for your participation. So look for more about the demographic dividend on www.prb.org. Thank you.